Every country has an army, theirs or somebody else's. It's time for Canada to stand up for our Army, Navy, and Air Force, our Canadian Armed Forces, to demonstrate to the world that as a nation, we take our democracy seriously.
Today, we are honored to host retired Lieutenant Colonel David Redman, a man whose distinguished military career and leadership expertise command immense respect. Colonel Redman dedicated 27 years to the Canadian Armed Forces, where he held multiple command positions, including 3 tours as a commanding officer. Among his many accomplishments, he managed the complex withdrawal of Canadian personnel and resources from Europe after the Cold War and oversaw critical operations during the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia. After transitioning from the military, Colonel Redmond continued to serve Canada as the Executive Director of Emergency Management Alberta, where he led the development of Alberta's counterterrorism crisis management plan following 9/11 and guided the province through major crises like the devastating floods of 2005. Today, he is a prominent advocate for strengthening Canada's defense policies, often speaking out about the consequences of underfunding our armed forces and falling short of NATO spending commitments.
Let's take a look. Colonel Redman, welcome to Northern Perspective.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to being here.
So the main focus of what we wanted to talk to you about, you were a 27-year veteran of our armed forces. On behalf of the tens of thousands of our viewers that are watching this, thank you for your service. One of our missions on Northern Perspective is to try to raise the profile of our veterans, of our current servicemen and women. We don't believe that they are celebrated nearly enough in Canada with the choices they make, the sacrifice for their country that they have offered. And it's really a travesty how they are treated in our opinion. So every chance we get, we want to raise the profile, thank our servicemen and women. So on behalf of everybody watching, I just want to thank you for your long service to this country. It's deeply appreciated.
Thank you very much. But more importantly, thank you for keeping the profile of our currently serving members and our veterans in Canadians' minds. Just quick comment, I remember Highway of Heroes during the Afghanistan conflict. This country has a massively proud history of military in action, starting with World War I, where we were the troops that led the way after Vimy Ridge. World War II, one of 5 beaches on D-Day, but not just Army, Air Force, and Navy as well on that day. The Korean War, we were the 3rd largest commitment in the Korean War. And so Canada has constantly punched way above its weight. We had the 3rd largest Navy in the world at the end of World War II. And right up to 1965, there were 105,000 men and women in uniform that quickly got decimated with the first Trudeau government. But Canada has a proud military history, one Canadians need to be reminded of and taught in our schools. And the veterans that have served were proud and enjoyed their time in the service. It was wonderful, and it's just sad that Canadians sometimes forget that the freedoms that they express now every day were bought with people's blood, and I hope in the future they remember better.
Well, and some Canadians are even cancelled for talking about the importance of it on Hockey Night in Canada, as well, as we all know what happened with Don Cherry in that case. People may not agree with everything that Don Cherry says, but you could not argue against the fact that he supported our armed forces like no other on national television, and it was an absolute disgrace what happened with him. But before we get into the meat of it, you wrote a paper for the Frontier Center for Public Policy. You've done some media rounds, and I think it's really pertinent to talk a little bit about that first as we engage in the discussion, because you have a very eloquent way of framing essentially the importance of government, in the importance of the armed forces in that, and what it means to actually have a successful and prosperous nation. So maybe just talk us through the primary 6 pillars that you speak about.
Absolutely. I believe that a country, in particular a democracy, is based on 6 national interests. And if I can just give a little historical perspective, when I was in the Royal Military College of Canada in the early 1970s, we were taught the national interests of our country, because as young officers aspiring to go out in the world with the maple leaf on our shoulder, it was important that we could constantly describe to people who came up to us what our country was all about, what we stood for, and why. And we watched as people constantly interacted with us, so proud of Canada and wanting ultimately many of them to become Canadians. So we were taught those national interests, and I put it to you, it would be very difficult to do that again, because people aren't talking about it in that way. So national interests define a country, in particular a democracy, but you start with a 25-year vision of where you want your country to be. And so anyone who wants to be an elected official in our country at all orders of government, municipal, provincial, territorial, federal, need to be able to speak with authority about where they want Canada to be in 25 years. And I picked 25 years because it's generational and it far outlasts a single government. But a 25-year vision then allows you to build a framework to go forward. And that framework should be based on, and I'll run through the 6 of them very quickly, but unity, national security, good governance, rights and freedoms, economic prosperity and growth, and personal and societal well-being and growth. Now, I'm sure we'll talk about all 6 of them as we go through discussions on many topics today, but the first 2, unity and national sovereignty, are the first 2 that define any country. A country, in simplest terms, is when a group of people who share common ethics and values come together inside a region with defined and defended borders. So without unity and without national security, you don't have a country to start with, and the other 4 fall apart very quickly. But that unity and the definition of a Canadian is so important. And when you hear a prime minister say that Canada has no defining culture and says things like a post-national state that I'm sure we can talk about at length, it's simply a lie, because a group of people need to be coherent and together with national security, or they're not a country. And the whole idea of post-national states is absolutely false and dangerous to a democracy, because the minute you say you're a post-national state, it means that the people who are elected to represent the population cease to be in charge of the nation. People outside the nation in a post-national state define what a country will do, and we've seen that in spades for the past 9 years in Canada. If you're a democracy, and the next 4 start with good governance, that's all about democracy, rights and freedoms. That's all about democracy. But in a post-national state, you are under an authoritarian rule that does not represent the people, that comes from afar. So you don't have a nation. And we can talk about that more. But the 6, again, just really quickly: unity, national security, good governance, rights and freedoms, economic prosperity and growth, and individual and societal well-being and growth. And individual society is education, healthcare, all the rest of that.
And you frame this in a way that I think is very pertinent, because it gives Canadians almost a starting point, because I think a lot of Canadians are in their current situation in Canada. They don't know what to do. They don't know even how to hold their government to account. So I think this is very pertinent, because it gives Canadians a baseline of, this is what I need to be challenging my politician in any level of government on. How are they How are they working in my interest, in my community's interest, to achieve these 6 national interests? And they should have answers to those questions for them, shouldn't they?
Absolutely. And I come back to municipal, provincial, territorial, federal, every order of government, school boards, everything that has a person who's elected to represent you has to be able to talk about a 25-year vision, where they see the country going, and base it completely on those 6 national interests. If they can't talk with authority, then don't vote for them. Don't let them be your elected official, because clearly they don't understand the role that they have to represent you.
Now, let's get to the a topic that we've talked about before, which is our spending, or rather lack of spending, on our military. So NATO requires that participating countries spend 2% of their GDP on defense in order to meaningfully and proportionally contribute to the NATO Armed Forces alliance as a whole. Now, I believe it was in as of 2023, Canada spent 1.29% or something like that of our GDP, which amounted to around $25 billion, which was about $15 billion short of that of that commitment. Now, when you're just talking about dollars and cents, I think it's hard for Canadians to understand what that actually translates into in terms of the men and women that are serving the armed forces and the equipment that they do or don't have. From what you've seen and from what you've heard, what does that translate into? What is the impact of essentially underspending by almost 40%?
So if you don't mind, I'll take you back just a little bit, frame it larger, and then come right down to your point. National security, one of the 6 national interests, is based on a strong intelligence system. It's based on strong border services, land, sea, and air. So it includes our Coast Guards, our border services, and a role for the Armed Forces of Canada. It includes a strong immigration system, so that people coming into our country reflect the values and interests of our country in a controlled and measured manner to support our country, and that don't internally try and break up national security. It includes our policing, it includes our courts, it includes an independent media that is pro-national security. So there's many elements that make up national security. The Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces are one essential part of it. And as I said in a paper with C2C Journal right before Christmas, the Canadian Armed Forces is the canary in the coal mine. When the canary dies, all of national security is affected, but it is equally important that we go back and look at our national intelligence system and the way that it's been ignored with foreign interference directly into our country. It's important that we look at the way that policing is not handling obvious terrorist activities in our streets on a routine basis every day, every week. So it all fits together. So now let's drill down a little bit into the Armed Forces of Canada. And as I said in the C2C piece, there are 5 essential components for the Canadian Armed Forces. And the first, I want to go back to my 25-year vision. You have to define, number 1, overall, the purpose of your military. What's the military in your country supposed to do? And in the case of Canada, when I joined the military, our tasks were very clear to me as a young lieutenant starting out. Sovereignty of Canada, number 1. Defense of North America, number 2. Cooperation with our allies and alliances. And the reason alliances are so important is Canada is a huge country with the 38th largest population in a geography which is the 2nd largest landmass. So it's quite obvious that Canada is always going to struggle to be able to take care of all of its defense of Canada on its own. So it's important that we have partnerships and alliances. So first of all, you have to define clearly what is the purpose of your military. But always remember that the military only has one reason for existence, and that is to fight. So the second element you need is combat-capable personnel. Those people spend their lives, their whole service, whether it's 3 years or 35 years with one purpose, and that is to be a war-fighting capable force. Hopefully not to be used, but when used, to be the best on the battlefield, and when not used, to be a deterrence against anyone looking at our sovereignty as a country. So combat-capable personnel, and I try and make it clear to everyone who talks to me that they don't just magically appear. You don't turn on a recruiting tap, and a Canadian walks in the door and poof, they're combat-capable. It takes 10 years to make a sergeant. A person who understands their individual skills, their collective skills, their battalion level skills, their brigade and higher level skills, the ability to interrupt with foreign countries, the ability to exchange ammunition and all the other elements that are needed. I give a simple example. Dash down, crawl, observe, sights, fire. The first thing any soldier's taught, those 6 words are life and death, and you practice them over and over and over. Someone shoots at you, you dash down, crawl, or roll, you take an observation, you select the range, and you shoot them. How long does it take to train a Canadian not to be a Canadian, but to react immediately to effective enemy fire, and to do it over and over and over again? And once you've trained them, to exercise and practice that constantly so they never lose that skill. And that's a one little tiny piece of being a soldier, right? And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So the second piece, combat-capable personnel. We're watching them walk out the doors, those very people that we took 10, 15, 20 years to develop for their positions, and they're walking away for a number of reasons that we can talk about. But combat-capable personnel. And there's no other purpose. They're not there to fight forest fires. They're not there to do UN missions. They're there to fight, close with, and kill the enemy, whether they're in the air, on the sea, or on the land. Combat-capable personnel. The next piece, the third piece, is equipment and supplies. So we need to give them all the tools they need, defined by the first element, purpose. Why do we buy equipment? It's to meet the purpose that the Canadian people, the people of Canada, have defined for their military. And if we're to be a combat-capable force, we need to give those personnel all the tools they need to take on whatever adversary our purpose has defined. Okay? So all that equipment, ships, jet fighters, planes, right down to the individual rifles and bayonets for the ground troops, tanks, anti-aircraft systems. So when you get to that third element, equipment, it's defined by purpose to match with those combat-capable soldiers so they're not just cannon fodder on a battlefield. The fourth element is strategic deployment capability. You need to be able to take that force anywhere in Canada to defend the sovereignty of Canada if enemies get into our country. You need to be able to strategically deploy that capability anywhere in the world that's defined by our purpose, but only our purpose. We don't send them to do things that Canadians don't want to be involved in, but we have to have that strategic capability to pick them up by ship, by rail, by plane, and get them where they need to be to do the mission we've given them in purpose. And the final element, the fifth element, is recruitment replacement. So on a day-to-day basis in peace, we need to be able to recruit people that want to be part of that force. We need to be able to replace the equipment before it becomes obsolete in a proper manner. And in times of war, we need to be able to build a huge surge capacity because you're going to need way more people, way more equipment, and you need to be able to get it where it needs to be in a timely fashion with all the ammunition and all the supplies and support. So that supply system in number 3 has to be combat capable because you have to be able to deploy it right into a theater of operations, and it needs to be self-sufficient and sustaining. When I was in the Army, we frequently went places where there was absolutely no infrastructure to support us. We had to bring everything with us. So we had to be able to strategically deploy it, number 4, sustain it, number 3, in a constant manner while keeping our people always on the edge of top combat effectiveness. So those 5 elements, you have to define the purpose. Because you can't just blow 2% of your GDP on toys that have no match to your purpose and that don't meet the operational capability of your combat-capable people. So we watched, I use the example of the 12 submarines. Suddenly and at last, the Trudeau government realized that it was under direct fire for the lack of 2%. So why 12 submarines? Well, someone in a back room did fast math and said 12 diesel-powered submarines. Do we even know they're useful in the Arctic? Do we even know that they meet any of the purpose that we've defined for our forces? Why 12? 12? Because when you did the fast math, 12 got us magically by 2032 to 2% of our GDP. It had nothing to do with purpose. It had nothing to do with correct equipment for purpose. It was a political game. And I put it to you, in 2015, this government said they were going to buy F-35 jets, they were going to buy new frigates, they were going to buy combat-capable equipment for the Army. None of it has happened. So when somebody says, quick solution to any problem, I immediately say, I call BS. It's not going to happen. It's simply a political expedient. It doesn't match purpose, combat trained personnel, equipment and supplies, a sustainment system and deployment system, and a replacement system and surge capacity.
Otherwise, we're just wasting taxpayer money. And although you're buying toys for the military, they could be some of the most useless pieces of equipment that we've bought. And now we've spent billions of dollars just to be able to say, well, we're spending 2%. And you're actually serving even further to most likely put these armed servicemen and women in harm's way because you're not giving them the equipment that they desperately need.
Absolutely correct. And we watched in the deployment into Latvia, soldiers having to buy their own rations and their own equipment, personal equipment, because we didn't take care of the basics and understand the purpose of that force, and we deployed them into harm's way without the kit they needed.
So when we talk about what our military's purpose is, do you think that's been lost over the years? Do you think... is it a combination of the people that are at the top of our military aren't having, the right conversations with our government? Is our government not giving the right guidance? Is there just, or is everything broken at the top? And this is one of the reasons we're in this situation.
So my simple answer is yes to everything he just said. It comes to the point that Canadians need to be re-engaged in all 6 national interests. And then they understand what they want. They have to make politicians understand what they want Canada to be. If they truly believe that Canada can sit on a North American continent and is safe from all threats, I think they're getting an awakening on their streets right now. We're watching protests in our streets calling for death of all Jews, death of all Christians, and death of all Canadians. The reason they're here is we didn't take all of the elements of national security seriously. The reason why we're not defining what is the purpose of the Canadian Armed Forces is because we have become complacent in the belief that Canada is an island on the planet where no risk will come to them. And if it is, we'll react to it magically. And we've seen this over and over and over again in the history of our country. This isn't the first time. I take you back to the early 1970s when I first joined the Army in 72. Pierre Trudeau had made it very public that he was going to withdraw Canada from NATO. He was going to downsize from 105,000 to 70,000. His aim was 40,000 to make a Peace Corps, a new Peace Corps. Back in the days, Peace Corps in the U.S. were a common thing. And that we were going to only do limited Peace Corps operations called peacekeeping, and we weren't going to be part of NATO. NATO said very clearly right then, no tanks, no planes, no trade. So we suddenly got tanks and we left 3 fighter squadrons in Europe, and the trade continued. September the 11th, Paul Cellucci, the American ambassador to Canada, over and over and over again said, security trumps trade. That was his 3-word slogan. You can go back in time, you can look. He gave speech after speech after speech as the American ambassador in Canada I met with him very personally. I gave him classified briefings when he came to Alberta. And because of that, I ended up doing a whole series of briefings to congressmen, senators, and the Department of Homeland Security as it stood up in Washington, D.C., because we were able to prove at the time that we took security seriously, at least in Alberta, and that we were secure trading partners, so trade wasn't interrupted. So all we're hearing now from south of the border is exactly what we've heard so many times before. Security trumps trade is an easy way of coining it. Back then, we called it security and prosperity, and we formed a partnership, Canada-US, to build both simultaneously, security and a prosperity. So we need to get back to the point of engaging Canadians to understand that national defense isn't a lodestone on the 6 national interests. It is a cornerstone of all national interests, including our economic well-being and growth, but also including all those other elements that make us a wonderful democracy that people want to become part of. So we need to re-engage Canadians, but we also need to re-engage our politicians at every order of government, but in this case, particularly the federal order of government, because they're responsible for the Canadian Armed Forces, and demand that they define the purpose of the CAF in a way that isn't to reduce it, but is to make it the cornerstone of a vibrant democracy.
Do you think that one of the reasons why we're kind of in this situation today, and I think you've harkened back that it goes back to the 70s and in Pierre Trudeau, but do you think that we're in this situation where there seems to be a disdain for our military? People don't like talking about it. People don't want to fund it because of this radical left identity politics ideology that has just taken over Western countries as a way of, victim blaming and shaming the people in charge, to the point where, they say that, the people in charge, all they do is start wars, and wars are bad, and if those people weren't in charge, we wouldn't have wars anymore. And that's perpetuated in the media, because again, the media doesn't talk about anything regarding our military.
Yeah, I feel like the left has neutered our military.
Okay, so yeah, I agree. So let me start on the premise that much of what you said I totally agree with, but let me perhaps frame it. If I go back to my 6 national interests, societal well-being, okay, number 6. I watched, in the early 1970s, I started having children with my beautiful wife. We've been married for 50 years this coming May. And I watched as my friends started talking constantly about things like helicopter parenting, and we're very pro it. That whenever a child experienced difficulty in their life, helicopter parenting meant you plucked the child out of a difficult situation and you put them somewhere safe and cuddly. And therefore, the child wasn't damaged by that terrible experience, and you were able to help them. We went through that for about 20 years. At the end of that 20-year period, it got worse. It became bulldozer parenting. So instead of those children that were helicopter parented, who had lost their self-respect and their self-discipline, became parents. And they got into bulldozer parenting. So for 20 years, we went through, you don't pluck the child out, you remove the horrible person who made their child feel uncomfortable. And we watched it happen in our schools. Teachers being thrown out of their jobs because they cared to discipline Sally and Jim for acting out inappropriately. Instead of dealing with the bad behavior of the child, we removed the teacher who had disciplined them. But it happened all through our society, not just in our schools, but everything that touched our children, we bulldozed our way through it. That group of 40 years is now in charge of our country. Even more so, Canadians as a group believe that all risk is not personal risk, it's government risk. It is the government's role to remove all risk from our society. And because of that thinking, we think that with the government's wonderful capabilities and all the money, that they can remove all of this risk. And it came perfectly timed, that 40-year period, to COVID. And what I witnessed in COVID, and which I wrote and phoned and talked and tried to get people to listen about, it's not the government's job to remove all risk from your lives. And yet people were happy to run into their homes, lock the doors, and say, government, pay me a salary to stay home to save me from this terrible virus, which was known in February 2020 to be only dangerous to people over the age of 65 with severe multiple comorbidities. As you went down from 65, the risk became less and much less than seasonal influenza, to the point that children, COVID, there wasn't a single COVID death in Canada. It was simply not a risk. And yet we closed their schools to protect them from this terrible virus because their parents demanded it and continued to. I watched websites where parents' action groups were livid when governments reopened schools before the end of the second year. We believe it became government's job, and it was this erosion. And so the reason I give you that context, and then I'll talk about the Canadian military, is because that's the framework in this democracy, Canada's democracy's mind, and I put it to you in most of the Western world. We saw this transformation, and it was slow and gradual, but we're at the point now where people believe government manages risk and that they don't need to be involved. So when you come to the Canadian military, I was in the Canadian Army in the early 1970s and went through the rebuild of the terrible Trudeau First era. I was then in the Canadian Army when we went through the Chrétien destruction of the Canadian Army and took us from a fighting force at that time of 85,000 back down to 60,000. I put it to you that it is much, much worse now. And so all of these cancel culture, social issues, and everything else, if you go to my 5 steps of the Canadian Armed Forces, they have directly attacked the purpose, and they've made it so that the purpose can't be defined. But even worse, they've attacked the combat-capable personnel. And so when you look at it and you bring DEI in, if you're not being promoted on merit, I don't care what your other evaluation system is, if you're not being promoted on merit, you are killing your fellow soldiers. You have to teach. If you're a sergeant, you have to teach the new privates. If you were promoted because you're not the best, then I don't want you. And so you ask me, where does this disdain? Well, the disdain comes from the government. But Canadians quickly turn around. Remember the Highway of Heroes? Remember the reaction of Canadians when they saw a combat-capable force standing up for democracy in Afghanistan and the terrible losses we took there in terms of mental health, physical health, and deaths, and how Canadians responded. They turned on a dime. Within a year, they were once again massively proud of their Canadian military and stood behind the necessity for a military. So I believe Canadians can quickly retransform when politicians take the time to explain that national defense is a cornerstone of our democracy, not a lodestone, and that we don't have all 6 national interests if we can't stand up and be seen to be standing up. So President Trump is simply re-identifying once again to Canadians that there's a cost for not taking your national security seriously. And in the paper in C2C Journal that I published in December, I start and end with the ancient Greek quote, every country has an army, theirs or somebody else's. It's time for Canada to stand up for our Army, Navy, and Air Force, our Canadian Armed Forces, to demonstrate to the world that as a nation, we take our democracy seriously.
Well, and it's very fascinating listening to you talk about this because, I've worked in IT for about 20 years now, and there's a lot of very similar parallels because when companies are looking at their IT departments, usually their focus is on give me systems that make me money. And the area that is neglected the most is security, because security in most cases, does not earn you money. It only costs money. And it is one of the first things on the balance sheet that, that gets cut next to staff salaries when they're looking to reduce costs. But it's also the first thing, and it's the first teams that they look at when there's a breach. Why don't we have security? What happened? And it's this constant struggle and case pleading between the security folks within IT with the guys that hold the dollars in the purse strings to say, listen, we're kind of your insurance policy here. The more you invest in us, the less chance there is of something actually happening. And if you don't invest in security at all, then you don't have a company at all. So the parallels are very, very striking to me.
Absolutely correct. My second career, for 13 years, I was in emergency management, and there's a lot of similarities between the military and emergency management. The key one is process and how you take a huge problem, get the right people in the room, assess the threat, do cost-benefit analysis for all the possible solutions, and develop a solution. But emergency management is built on 4 fundamental principles. So's defense of a nation: mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery. If you don't spend the dollars in mitigation, and it is the worst emergency management function in Canada, we do it the least, but it is the most important. Mitigation is either taking the target from the hazard or taking the hazard from the target. Okay, that's simplest terms. And what you just defined in IT is exactly what the Canadian military, in terms of mitigation, does. It either removes the target from the hazard from the target, and you do it through threat of use or actual use. Okay, and so when you're talking IT, and when we talk about fires, floods, tornadoes in our country, we need to do mitigation. And if you don't spend money on mitigation, you will spend 10 times as much on recovery. Okay? Now, preparedness recognizes the fact that you can never achieve perfect mitigation.
Correct.
So, for what you can't mitigate, you prepare to respond very quickly. And in preparation, you train over and over and over and over again. So in the military, knowing that there will always be an enemy who doesn't take us seriously, we can't mitigate them out of existence. Sooner or later, you're going to have to respond. So you train over and over and over and over again. And what I try and get across to people with respect to the Canadian military, every day, and I do this with premiers to their face, I do this with everyone, every day that you ask the military to do something other than fight or to prepare to fight, you are taking away their preparedness. You are stopping them from being the force you want them to be when you have to respond. Their job is to fight. It's not to do forest fires. It's not to do floods. It's not to do peacekeeping. Everything that tells a soldier to put their rifle down is not part of the Canadian Armed Forces. And filling a sandbag is putting your rifle down. Carrying a shovel and squirting a little water onto hot spots is putting your rifle down. Sailors at sea, planes in the air, troops on the ground, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery, and it ties to every walk of life. You've pointed it out in IT. I put it to you that it fits in every industry, in every business. That time they don't spend on mitigation, they spend in recovery later, times 10.
Well, and this is one of the beauties about process. I was forced into process and learning about it in 2010. Thought it was the stupidest decision my boss had ever made. Came to realize that my boss made the smartest decision that he made regarding my career, because people don't seem to understand that if you get a process person, they can walk into any industry, any company, any situation, and within an hour probably know more about what is actually happening in that situation than the people that have been there for 10 years, because they look at it from a different way. And the process that you outlined is almost verbatim what would be done in IT security, but it also sounds very familiar to business continuity and contingency management. So, when you're talking preparedness, my equivalent word for that is unmitigated risk. So you have your risks that you do mitigate, and then the ones that you can't, you identify that you can't, and then you, to your point, you prepare the strategy of how you're going to handle all of those potential situations, and then at least you know what to do when something happens. And this is where IT departments across the world struggle when there's a data breach, because they've identified that there was an unmitigated risk that they did not take into consideration, or their mitigation strategy was completely faulty. But it's that much more important from a national defense perspective, because to your point, so if our mitigation strategy is terrible in Canada, which it seems to be, then that means that our preparedness strategy is equally as terrible, if not more. And then it just compounds the further down you go. And the cost, I would argue the cost isn't expensive. The cost is we lose our country.
Well, and it seems to me that one of the mitigations might be to have more troops, more soldiers, more recruitment. And I understand that's an issue for Canada right now. Are you able to talk about that a bit?
In 1965, Canada had 105,000 people in uniform, Army, Navy, and Air Force, in a country of under 20 million. 1967, we made the song 1, 2, 3 little Canadians. Now we are 20 million. We finally made it to 20 million. We were so proud. And we had an armed forces of 105,000. We're now a country of 40,000. And the world expects us to do a commensurately higher mitigation to defend our own country. Alliances look at us and say, okay, you were 20 million then, so you should have 200 million people in uniform now? We have a government that has fully admitted that they were hoping one day to be 71,000, but that we're 17,000 short, so we're down in the 50s. But that of that 50,000, we actually can only operationally deploy 58%. That means we have under 32,000 combat capable. Remember my 3 steps. Number 2 is people. We only have under 34,000. The New York City Police Department in uniform every day has 35,000. So we have an armed forces, Army, Navy, and Air Force, smaller than the New York City Police Department, for the second largest geographic landmass with 3 huge coastlines. We're not taking it seriously. And as you point out, mitigation is showing to your enemy, target from hazard, hazard from target, showing your enemy, you come here, we are ready. We have combat capable people in a massive amount, ready to deploy strategically anywhere in our country, deployed constantly, but capable to do surge capacity anywhere in our country, any one of our coasts, standing off from our coast and defending our airspace on a moment's notice. So you want to play? Watch. We're preparing every day to play. Watch how we prepare. Show them how we train, how we equip, how we are constantly ready, and that we have all 5 of those elements. And you got to do it by first defining purpose, right? And so that purpose says to the world, you don't want to come and play with us. And when we come and play on your field, we might not be the biggest bears on the battlefield, but we're 10 times the value of any other soldier in the world. And that's how we used to be perceived. I remember back in the Cold War. Remember, the Cold War was real in Europe. It certainly wasn't to Canadians, but it was to Europeans. When the sirens went off at 4 o'clock in the morning, we ran to our equipment, deployed to the inter-German Czech borders, and stood facing the Russians, which were 10 times our size, and said, come on, we're ready. And mitigation worked. They never took the bait and attacked. They could have, but they chose not to. 1981, when Solidarity was formed in Poland, they moved 10 divisions, a division being over 11,000 soldiers, each division, to the inter-German Polish border. And we, NATO, deployed straight back. And in fact, they didn't do to Poland what they had done to Czechoslovakia and Hungary before. They stepped back. Mitigation works. When you say, we're ready to play, are you? You have it gives you an influence. And what our trading partners in the last 10 years have realized is we're not serious. That's why we're not. It used to be called ABCA, the American, British, Canadian, Australian Partnership. New Zealand was part of it, but they didn't get a letter in the alphabet. ABCA has thrown the sea out. And you now see the American, Australian, British partnership buying submarines and making defense partnerships in the Pacific without us. Mitigations, lack of mitigation, says to your allies and your enemies that you're not serious as a country, and therefore you will be punished in economic prosperity. You will be punished in your societal strength and your individual well-being. And we're watching it in our streets, because I don't keep pointing to Trump. I keep pointing to Canada. What's happening in Canada? And that's the cause of what our allies, all our allies, not just the U.S., how they treat us.
Well, and it's fascinating because, I think many Canadians are aware of kind of the geopolitical dynamics that are happening over in Europe right now with Russia and Ukraine and Finland in terms of joining NATO. And I recall that Russia had, did some saber rattling, kind of warning Finland not to join NATO, or, there might be consequences. And Finland's response was essentially, come and get us. And it's interesting because they're very, I think, confident and proud in their military. So I did a little research, and I was very interested to see actually how they operate over there. So they spend about 2.3% of their GDP on defense. Now, they're only a country of about 5.6 million people, and they have about 24,000 active armed forces servicemen and women. So Canadians looking at them, they may see that and say, well, we're much more superior in military because, we have, 3 times the amount of servicemen and women. Well, you got to dig a little deeper, because we have in our reserve forces, I think around 27,000 in reserves. But I was shocked to see the amount of people in the Finnish reserves. 870,000 people are
Holy
in
smokes.
the armed forces reserves in Finland. Why? Because they have a mandatory male conscription as part of their national defense strategy. To your point, how are we going to defend our country with a big country like Russia, right on the front door? So when you take that in terms of the percentage of the population, Canada has 0.23% of our population that is in our armed forces, active and reserve, whereas Finland has 16% of their whole, it's basically almost, approaching a quarter of their whole country that can stand up and fight on a moment's notice. So it's very interesting to see the different strategies versus this. And now, that's the crazy thing. Finland has a country that is 4 times less populated than us, but their military is potentially 10 times more powerful just because of the way that they've approached it. It's just, it boggled my mind. So it just, to me, when you're talking about the approach to military, the goals, the 6 pillars of that you've outlined, and how you approach even constructing your military, the difference is night and day between Canada and Finland and many other countries.
Absolutely correct. And so when you define purpose, going to the 5 steps to rebuild our Canadian forces, and the reason I wrote the C2C paper, the first half I described history, then how we got here. And then in the second half, I define the statement of requirements, an SOR, if you will, for an RFP, and then the actual process, because you and I are process people, the process, the step-by-step process to within 3 years to rebuild. I built it as a positive, not as a negative. The first half says how we are and why we got here. The second half says, how do you fix it? Because as a soldier, I was always taught never to walk into my commander's office without a solution to a problem. If you walk in with a problem and you don't have a solution, you went out really quick and sometimes with a boot. So the whole point is we can turn this around, and we can turn it around. And I lived through the 1970 turnaround of the Canadian Forces after first Trudeau. We can do it again now. So the positive thing, but how do you define purpose? I want to come back. I don't want to lose the thought. Geopolitics is a huge part of the definition of our purpose. Now, we have been lucky in our history, unlucky at times, lucky later, that we sit on the border with a superpower. Finland sits on the border with the superpower. Okay? Russia is the superpower. The United States is a superpower. Finland's superpower hates them and wants to dominate them and take them, if necessary, by force. Fortunately for our history, since 1812, our superpower didn't want to destroy us and take us over, even though manifest destiny, the doctrine of manifest destiny, has always been the American vision. And manifest destiny, for those that haven't studied in history, is the Americans in the 1800s decided that all of North America belonged to them, including Mexico, all the way down to the Panama, and all the way north to the Arctic. And that it was only a matter of time, evolution would make it so, and they would take over the whole continent, and then they would have national security. Okay, so this is nothing new. So our geopolitical situation in Finland are completely different and have been for the past 50, 100 years. Certainly Sir John A., when he formed Canada in 1867, saw the threat from the United States. They had a huge standing army. They had just finished the American Civil War, and manifest destiny was on every politician's mouth. And first they were going to take their own West, and then they were going to take ours. Okay, so when Sir John A. built Canada, he did that with the knowledge that he needed to take national security in our country seriously. Part of the railroad was so that we could move troops back and forth across our country quickly and effectively. All of that happened then. But we've become complacent because we have this wonderful neighbor who we have a huge economic trading partnership with and who routinely doesn't threaten us as Russia has threatened Finland, Sweden. So Finland and Sweden as well, realized that they sit on the doorstep in geopolitics of a huge and not well-intentioned superpower. The same thing is true, though, for little tiny Switzerland. And they've been surrounded by all those European countries for hundreds of years and took their sovereignty extremely seriously. And sovereignty, defense of North America, partnership with alliances, my three focuses, and we'll come to, I believe we should only focus on two for the next 10 years. Sovereignty, defense of North America, and I'll explain that if you want later. But Switzerland, look at all those countries. Every single male in Switzerland is part of the army from 18 to 65, very similar to Finland, very similar to Sweden. And so you do your training, then you do an annual call out, but it's even more than that. Every piece of infrastructure in Switzerland is built so that it can be denied to the enemy. So no matter which route people come in, they have pre-mined all the roads. They have pre-mined all the tunnels. If you're driving down the road in Switzerland one day on one of their autobahns, when you go bump as you go into a tunnel, there's giant manhole covers, and that's where the mines are placed to blow up and then seal the tunnels. Okay? They mitigate the hell out of stopping the target from the hazard. The hazard can't get to the people. That's the same true for Finland, the same true for any, especially countries that wanted to be independent. Like Finland and Sweden only just joined the NATO alliance. And we can talk about NATO's expansion if you want, but the whole point of an armed forces is to meet, number one, the sovereignty of your country. And you do it through all of the steps, but you have to have combat trained people. And so from their point of view, their combat capability includes every male in their country. And whether they're trained annually, weekly, you can ramp it up, ramp it down, depending on the threat level. Right?
Well, and this is where we need to start thinking like Sweden and Finland and take this seriously. Like
we do. My threat analysis, it is time for Canada as a nation to reorient from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Our biggest threat is China. Our second biggest threat is the IRGC that is already in our country, paid by China. Okay? The money for the IRGC, the Islamic Open Guard, the military wing of Iran, is marching in our streets. They have bases and operating groups, but China still has police stations, still directly interferes in our elections, still directly is interfering in our companies. Why? Because they want to take over Canada? No. They want to use us as a springboard to get to our partner to the south. And our partner to the south knows it, is watching it every day. So what the IRGC and China is doing in our country, I've put it to you, the threat from Russia in our country right now is 1/100th of China. And so we need to reorient with our allies and partners our thinking in terms of purpose and face to the Pacific, less to the Atlantic. Now, you never turn your back on the Atlantic because our trading partnerships and everything else that go to Europe are important today, extremely important, and we need to show that we take that seriously as well. But it's time to reorient north and to the west rather than east, if you're looking at the country of Canada. And to do it in a coherent manner by defining the purpose and defining what sovereignty means and how we're going to achieve it. And that's why in the C2C paper I talk about, we need to have physical presence on all three coasts. We need to have physical presence in our airspace, and we need to have physical presence in every province and territory in Canada, permanently established, with a surge capability to add to whichever one is threatened most at any given period of time. And so when we're talking Arctic sovereignty, it's one piece. And everyone just wants to say, oh, it's just Arctic sovereignty. That's what we need to. No. We have problems inside our country. We have problems on all three coasts that we need to address and in our airspace. And you being an IT guy, in the paper, I clearly define space and cyber. Those have to be included, okay? Because somebody just a reporter was asking me just this week about buying 2 helicopters to increase our border services, and I just laughed. And the reason I laughed is I said, first you have to define purpose. And so if you're talking border security, and just for fun, let's forget about the coast for just a sec, and we definitely can't. But just the landmass of that 8,890 kilometer land border with our largest trading partner, you have to think of it in 3 fundamental steps: surveillance, target acquisition, target neutralization. Surveillance is the hardest. 24/7, you need a surveillance system that can watch that 9,000 kilometers and watch for activity. And in surveillance, it's called DRI, detection, recognition, identification. First, you detect movement. Okay, something's happening through the woods over here. Then you have to be able to recognize what it is. It's a flock, a group of deer, or it's a group of people. Okay, so that's recognition. Identification. It is a group of people, and they're carrying a whole bunch of shit, and they shouldn't be. They're illegally moving something in an area. So you've just got through the first step of surveillance. How does 2 helicopters help that? Okay, let's move to the next step, target acquisition. You now know there's a group of people doing something really bad, or you think it's really bad. You now need to do target acquisition. You need to attach the correct response assets to the target, and you need to strategically be able to get them there in a timely manner to interrupt that movement before they get to their objective or before they disappear. Okay, so that's target acquisition, right asset to the target. And then target neutralization. Well, we're in a free and democratic country, so we don't just drop a 500-pound bomb on them. They might just be a group of people who got lost on their ski holiday. Once you get there with the asset, you find out for sure, and you neutralize the threat in the right way. If it's no threat at all, they carry on, and they were lost in the woods, and now you've helped them find their way home. If they're bringing fentanyl across the border, you do the appropriate, handing them over to legal authority, you do the court system, you do whatever you need to do. But if they're armed and dangerous and try and take you out when you arrive, then you neutralize them in a different way. And so suddenly we have a government that says they got a bunch of drones and 2 helicopters, and the United States, it's okay, we've taken care of the border. As I said on my X post, I call BS, right? It's a political demonstration, not an actual capability response. And so you've got people making decisions about national security which have held it in disdain, all elements of it, our intelligence services, our border services, our military, our courts, all that have been held in disdain, okay? And so we need to have a responsible government that takes national security, and even more so unity, the first 2 fundamentals of the 6 national interests that define a democracy, seriously and in a timely, immediate manner addresses them. And that's why I wrote the paper in C2C Journal on rebuilding the Canadian Armed Forces unfit for duty, because I want to present a possible, I'm not the brightest guy in the world, but I brought my process to it, and this is my step-by-step solution, that within 3 years we can have an armed forces that the people of Canada can be proud of again, if they actually want an armed forces or if they want to be Canadians. It's up to Canada to define what Canada wants, and Canadians need to inform their politicians and demand of their politicians a 25-year vision to take Canada somewhere that Canadians want to go. And if it's to be a communist country, then I'll step back, but I don't believe that's what Canadians want.
Well, and it can also be a military that I'm sure the men and women serving in can be proud of right now, because...
Absolutely. And I'm sorry I didn't get back to the original point, which was recruiting. How do you recruit someone into a combat-capable force if they know they will never be deployed and that they will be held in disdain by their government? So you have to define the purpose that all Canadians want, and then recruiting fixes itself. I watched it in 1970s, the early 70s. I watched people fled back into the armed forces. My problem as a lieutenant with 85 soldiers, with 1 master warrant officer, 5 warrant officers, and 1 sergeant and 1 master corporal, is I had to train 80 privates to get them back to be corporals and master corporals, and do that 10-year process. I, in the paper, talk about an accelerated process, but you won't attract anyone looking at the armed forces as it is now. And so you have to redefine purpose, and you have to tell people that are joining that, yes, we're back in business, and your only job is to be combat capable.
Well, and it sounds like obviously there's a lot of work to do on the military, but even from a policy standpoint, we need to make a decision as a country that our military is important and that it's non-negotiable, that it is necessary in order to allow us to have the security and certainty and comfort to fund all of these other social programs that Canadians may take advantage of or not. But the point is same as the IT example. If you don't have security, then you don't have a country. And if you don't spend on security, then what is the point on spending money on pharmacare, on a school lunch program, when you can't even have any confidence that you would be able to protect it if and when that time came? So I think Canadians should really take your suggestions to heart, have the conversations with municipal, provincial, and federal officials when they're running for elections, even when they're not running for elections, so they know what to expect. And we need to make our armed forces a priority once again. We need to make all of the other teams that are part of national security a priority again, because as you said, it's not just the armed forces, it's CBSA spending money properly. You know, they've been having such a hard time with their PR image because of everything going on in that agency, spending billions of dollars and achieving nothing. You know, local police services, CSIS, they need more resources. We need to be trusting them more with the intelligence that they're providing and act on it. So I think this was a phenomenal talk. We could probably talk for another 3 hours based on everything else, but I think we'll have to cut it there for now, Colonel Redmond. But we would love to have you back to continue this discussion on all of the other facets, because they're just as important as what we've talked about today.
Absolutely correct. All 6 national interests, we need to talk about each one of them and what makes them up in the fullness, and why it's so important for Canada to move forward right now. And I believe we can. I believe we're here. And I believe the interest finally has peaked in Canadians, that they see that something's wrong and they're ready for transformation. We just need to make sure that they engage and become part of it.